Thank you very much indeed. And I'll now move to our final speaker, and we'll just move along as we're getting very close to time. So that is our next speaker is Mark Butler, who was elected as the Labor Member of Parliament for Port Adelaide and Hindmarsh in the Australian Parliament in 2007 and is the Shadow Minister for Health and Ageing. Mark served as Minister for Ageing and Australia's first Minister for Mental Health in the last Labor government. He has also held several other ministries and was elected as National President of the Australian Labor Party in 2015 and is now currently the Senior Vice President. So welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Sue. It's really quite an honour to be invited to say a few words at this seminar, and I really enjoyed the previous contribution from Serena. I want to venture very quickly to say that I speak at this seminar not as the spokesperson for foreign affairs and not as a particular expert in this area, but someone who has become deeply engaged with the Cambodian Australian community in my own state of South Australia, particularly as the local MP, and really quite moved and mobilised to speak out as far as I possibly can, both in the Australian Parliament, the Australian media, and from time to time in the international media, about the shocking and frankly disheartening descent into authoritarianism that we've seen, particularly over the last 4 or 5 years in Cambodia. I want to pay real tribute to, well, particularly the South Australian, Cambodian, Australian community, but I know across the country for the level of resolve that Cambodian Australians are showing in the face of the heartbreaking events that are happening in their homeland. They are mobilising, they are showing extraordinary courage, and they are advocating for what I think are very reasonable and realistic reactions and solutions at the Australian Parliament level. The local community in South Australia, with leaders like Sameth Lem, the South Australian president of the CNRP, have just been fantastic in informing us, in urging us to be more courageous, and to speak out about what is happening in Cambodia. And through that community, I've been able to sit down before his imprisonment with Mr. Kem Sokha, with his daughter Monavithya when she was here in Australia, with Musa Kaur, just an extraordinary woman, and Chris Bowen and I were able to attend Sam Rainsey's National Press Club address a little while ago too. So that level of engagement and information really lifts the ability for members of Parliament like myself, and I know Julian, to speak out as much as we possibly can. And I can tell you there is no fiercer advocate for the interests of freedom and democracy in Cambodia in the Australian Parliament than Julian Hill. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with him as a friend and colleague in the Labor opposition. The Cambodian Australian community has become such an important part of what I think is the most successful multicultural community on the face of the planet. They've built lives here. They've contributed enormously over the last 30 or 40 years ago to Australia, but understandably, like every diaspora community here in Australia, part of their heart remains in their homeland of Cambodia, and they rightly have been quite shocked by events, particularly over the last 4 or 5 years since the 2018 election, particularly around freedom and democracy and corruption, as Serena outlined so articulately, and the abuse of human rights and the victimisation of a range of NGO movements, particularly in the environment sector, the media sector and such like. We've seen, as Serena outlined, Cambodia really plummet in the world's rankings around corruption, but also in the democracy index over the last 5 years, plummeting a number of places to become only one of 6 countries in the Asia region that are described by the Economist Democracy Index as authoritarian. And there's no doubt in my mind that that description is a completely accurate and apt one. But this conference is about where to from here. So again, I qualify these remarks by saying I'm not a particular expert in international affairs, and I don't speak for the Labor Party on foreign affairs. I speak for the Labor Party on health and ageing, which is a fair distance from that matter. Let me say a few things that I, and I'm sure Julian and a number of my other colleagues, are particularly intent upon continuing to focus on and advocate about. The first is obviously the upcoming elections. As I understand it, voter registration is already open for the commune elections that are scheduled for the middle of next year. as a lead into the national elections due in 2023. It is obviously hard to imagine how they are going to be able to be free and fair with the dissolution of the CNRP, the jailing of political leaders, the exile of so many others. But having said that, Australia, the Australian community, Australian leaders and members of parliament must be relentless in continuing to call for free and fair elections and for the reinstatement of a party like the CNRP as the major opposition party. We must also, as Serena just outlined so articulately, continue to speak out about every atrocity, and there are so many of them, but every atrocity committed by the Hun Sen regime. We have this saying here in Australia that the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. And while that is a completely apt way in which I think to live your life as an individual, it should also be a way in which a state governs itself as part of the international community. So whether it is talking about the threats that Hun Sen made some time ago about violence against Australians, speaking out against that, whether it's the ongoing CPP intimidation against Cambodian Australians that the Cambodian Australian community in South Australia reports to me regularly, or whether it is about the hoarding of assets and wealth through poor money laundering arrangements here in Australia that Serena talked about, we must continue to call them out. We must continue to call them out. But we face an environment where the international community, and I'm sure others have spoken about this more articulately than I can, we face a situation where the international community is not united about calling out Hun Sen for his atrocities and his failure to implement the 30-year-old accord. We face a situation where Hun Sen's regime does continue to get support and succour from other major players, obviously, in the international community. So calling these things out, will we know from Hun Sen's history, not lead him to change? There needs to be action taken, and that's why for some time now, the Labor Party, as I'm sure Julian pointed out, has called for Australia to put in place I always have trouble with this word, Magnitsky-style legislation, as increasingly is happening around the democratic world. We called for that in July last year. There was a Senate inquiry, as you know, that led to a clear recommendation from the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Senate to introduce bipartisan legislation of that type. And I want to again thank the Cambodian Australian community and the association for the extraordinary organising effort you undertook to put submissions and put evidence to the inquiry to make sure that the recommendations that came from that report were good. And we introduced a private members bill as the Labor Party in August this year to try and push this process along. Now, the government has assured us that their legislation will be presented before the end of the year, but the clock is ticking on that, to be frank. And although we have said, as the opposition and Penny Wong have said, that we are very keen to cooperate with the government on this and to make sure that this is a bipartisan effort, we can't sit back forever and wait for the government to act on something that has been a clear recommendation from a bipartisan committee now for coming up to 12 months. So this must be actual legislative mechanisms for us to take action against the regime, as Serena pointed out, against senior actors and family members of Hun Sen who are laundering money here. Real action that actually imposes a price for the atrocities continually being committed by the regime must be put in place by the Australian Parliament, as it must be by parliaments and congresses across the democratic world. I make the commitment to continue to be as strong an advocate as I possibly can for freedom and democracy in Cambodia. This is, I think, a very proud part of Australia's history over the last few decades, the role that the Australian government, particularly Gareth, played along with the Cambodian Australian community in bringing together those peace accords. And 30 years on, a key element of those accords, a key promise around freedom and democracy is yet to be delivered. And if anything, over the last 4 or 5 years has looked ever more distant from being delivered than over the last 3 decades. Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you. I've had to duck out of the state conference of the Labor Party here in South Australia to speak to you. So I'm going to have to leave you and go and participate in a debate about submarines policy. But can I just thank you for your courage, your advocacy and your level of organisation and the generosity of your time with members of Parliament like Julian and myself in making sure that we are as well informed as we possibly can be when we participate in these important national debates.
Thank you very much, Mark. That's extremely good to have you here. Thank you for making the time to duck out of submarines in the conference. And you raised some very interesting issues today too. A lot has come up, but thank you very much for attending. Okay, thank you.